Extraordinary Phenomena Investigations Council presents Epic Voyages. Come join us as we enter and experience the great mysteries of the world with tonight's host, James Clarkson.
You say too much to learn. You say cover up the spine. That's your plan, not mine. I'm ready to be told. Time for secrets to unfold. It's our time to come of age. Time for truth to turn the page. Don't wanna be inside the dark. Live within a question mark. Are they a friend or foe? Tell me now. You need to know.
Good evening, everyone. This is a broadcast of the Inception Radio Network sponsored by EPIC, the Extraordinary Phenomena Investigations Council. We research, investigate, and present the world's great mysteries, and I am your host, James Clarkson. There is no subject that is closer to my heart or that I'm more interested in than getting to the bottom of the mystery of unidentified flying objects. And tonight, I have an opportunity to share with you the insights of a gentleman that I am very fortunate to call friend and mentor. His name is Peter Robbins. Just to briefly go over his many accomplishments, he's been involved in UFO studies for at least 25 years as a researcher, investigator, writer, lecturer, best-selling author. He's been involved with the Bud Hopkins Intruders Foundation, the UFO Media Group of Central Park. He holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Painting and Film History from Manhattan School of Visual Arts. He was an instructor in painting for years. He's also worked as a theater manager and assistant director for New York's Mir Repertory Company. He's spoken on the subject of UFOs for more than 20 years and lectured in more than 20 states, Canada, France, numerous talks in the United Kingdom, to the benefit of numerous national and local UFO conferences for MUFON, Bufora in Great Britain, other grassroots organizations, private groups, schools, universities, and almost too many places to mention. He had the privilege of working and associating with Dr. John Mack, and among his lecture topics are the suppression of UFO information by the American and British governments, our first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, Dr. Wilhelm Reich and UFOs, and most especially the RAF Bentwaters UFO Incident, also known as the Rendlesham Forest Incident from 1980, the UFO abduction phenomena, and the media and UFOs. And in 1978, he was the research assistant on the United Nations Secretary General's requested report for the establishment of a United Nations UFO department. And in order to keep it brief, at that, I will introduce you to my good friend, Peter Robbins. Good evening, Peter.
Hi, James. Good to be with you.
It's very good to be with you. And tonight I'm hoping that we can cover a number of subjects, specifically some key historical events that remain ever present and always important in the field of UFOs. And in a broader sense, I'm hoping we can tie that into where all of this might be going, since right now ufology is in a very challenging place, and I, among many other people, am not quite sure where we're all going. So I guess as a starting point, I will just briefly relate how I became involved in UFOs. And actually, ironically, it's because of a radio broadcast many years ago, and as a teenager, I was home alone in my house listening to a KGO radio station in San Francisco, when an author named John G. Fuller had just published a new book, and of course that was new many years ago, called Incident at Exeter, and he started telling the stories that were related to one of the most remarkable collection of UFO encounters that I know of. And I remember being struck most vividly because even then I was interested in going into law enforcement, which later became my career. I wondered how it was that a UFO could come down so low that a patrol officer would grab a witness, push him to the ground, and draw his service weapon, only to be warned into reholstering it by his partner, as I recall.
Yeah.
And then he was informed when it was all over that he had made a mistake and that he was actually drawing his weapon on U.S. Air Force refueling craft. And with that, I will let you lead us into Exeter.
Well, it's funny, even as you were talking about you're listening to that broadcast, I immediately deduced that happened in 1966 because that's when John G. Fuller, now gone, but a wonderful investigative writer who had the courage, really, and the tenacity, the stick-to-itiveness to get involved in what was certainly seen as a controversial story at the time. I also was captivated by this story, this incident. I first became involved in the mid-'70s in this subject, in part because I had three major mentors as I came up through the ranks. One is, for many of your listeners, the very well-known Bud Hopkins, who most of us in the field regard as kind of the father of serious studies in the abduction phenomena. But the other two, equally pragmatic, was a military scientist and historian, a former staff officer in the Hungarian army during the war, an expert in photo analysis named Count von Kvetski. And the third, who in fact is cited as one of the two people that the first edition of Left at East Gate, the book about the British Rendlesham Forest incident that I co-wrote, is dedicated to, as a tough, no-nonsense American archetype. He was a New York City police detective, highly decorated, injured in the line of duty a number of times, a Brooklyn Italian-American, no-nonsense guy who also happened to be a crack UFO investigator. And early on, I, number one, had a particular respect for individuals in law enforcement who were not only caught up as witnesses in serious, truly paranormal UFO events, but who on top of that had the courage to go forward and discuss or report their observations, knowing full well that the ridicule factor attached to this subject, which unfortunately is still very much part of it, no matter how many cool documentaries come out, we, the American people, have been deeply conditioned to wire the subject in with tremendous ridicule, even delusional thinking. And, that's no surprise to anybody familiar with the subject. But the police officer that you're talking about in the incident at Exeter case really had tremendous courage, and he and his partner, in fact, after that unbelievable cavalier, insulting dismissal of their event, these were people, after all, who, although not military, although they were veterans, worked in an area with a huge honkin' Air Force base. They knew their aircraft, and to suggest that they had confused a refueling vehicle with a truly anomalous object that was so intimidating that he pulled his service weapon on it, they were angry enough that they petitioned Project Blue Book, the then record-keeping, although now we know it was more a vanity in terms of making the Air Force look like they were doing something when they really were doing all they could to ridicule the subject and having the appearance of a group that took the subject more seriously than they actually did. But as I recall, Project Blue Book did send them some kind of letter bordering on an apology. And of course, the incident at Exeter, as the subject became known, this particular case, is now the subject of an important, growing annual event that takes place in really about 5 weeks in Exeter, New Hampshire, the third annual Exeter UFO Conference, which I'm proud to be a co-founder of and working very hard to let folks know about.
That's truly exciting. And I just wanted to point out one of the things that popped into my head while you were describing that is the kind of training that law enforcement officers get because of the extreme liability and moral responsibility attached to discharging your weapon. You are taught to react to an immediate deadly threat. That's the justification for drawing your weapon.
Yeah.
It's not because of a distant object, and if a police officer's eyesight was so bad that he couldn't tell the difference between an aircraft and something that might be immediately a threat, he certainly shouldn't be driving a patrol car, let alone carrying a weapon.
Well, not only is that an important point, James, but I think this is something to dwell upon for a moment. Law enforcement personnel, for me, are the equivalent of combat soldiers on a certain level. They get paid a very modest amount of money to put their lives on the line every single day, unlike almost any other profession in the civilian realm, here as well as in other countries. But in the States, as opposed to in Great Britain, where police officers are, certainly as well trained and as courageous, they are trained to put their own safety very often before that of a victim, and to only go after, as we say, an alleged perpetrator, if it does not seem to be something that will bring on an immediate life and death threat upon their own person. American police officers overall exhibit tremendous courage on a daily basis, and yes, this point is crucially important for anybody condescending and insulting and behind those things, frightened and ignorant about this subject to such a degree that they would malign a police officer or even suggest that they were not, in their proper mindset or perceiving a situation accurately to unholster their weapon. So yes, my reflexive sense from many police officers that I've interviewed who have been involved in sighting events at the least, and a handful who have been involved in considerably more, is these are some of the best trained observers we have in our civilian reality, and if anything, should be praised for their double courage in coming forward in such events. And this can destroy your career. There's no question about it. The ridicule factor, especially in a very, macho career bent, can be ferocious, and police officers themselves can ridicule other officers because it is something that we would rather make fun of than take seriously because the implications are really unnerving.
I think it's like whistling by a graveyard.
Well said.
And whenever you mention the toll that has been taken on certain people, I can't help but mention somebody whose final resting place by now, I don't think anybody has established with certainty, was Deputy Dale Spower from the Portage County, Ohio Sheriff's Office, who was involved in the famous chase of the UFO, I believe, most of the way across Ohio and just into Pennsylvania. And he had an encounter with, I believe, Major Quintanilla from Project Blue Book.
Indeed.
There was adverse publicity, and he basically cracked under the pressure, and his career was gone, his marriage was gone, and I don't really know what finally happened to him.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'm familiar with a handful of cases as well that fall into this realm, a few of them that I've taken in confidence over the years from family members. I find them particularly infuriating. And in fact, we see it replicated every single day. Every time a newsreader reads, into that last part of the television news, an account of a credible sighting, but whether or not they're encouraged to, or it's just reflexive, the wink and the nod, the nudge, the folks, I'm just reading this stuff, I wish I didn't have to, because we all know this is nonsense. And that, for me, brings up the great mantra of debunkers, which is, it can't be, therefore it isn't, therefore it must be something else. And the something else's fall into these areas. You are delusional. You, in their terminology, want to feel special. You have misinterpreted an explainable phenomena. You want to be famous or be on the Oprah show or write a best-selling book, or you're a hoaxer. Well, the incidence of hoaxes are extremely low in the history of this event, something which I find doubly interesting because alleged early hoaxing from the summer of 1947, when all of this kicked in the Western world, was used as a rationale for major media from that moment on to belittle the subject. And when one really studies day by day, region by region, the reported accounts that appeared in local newspapers, the nationals that were referred to in declassified documents, they were all but nil. So, as Shakespeare would say, methinks the lady doth protest too much. And one wonders whether or not a certain suggestion was made from high up and simply became the rule of thumb with publishers and editors. And the next thing we know, we have a media that moves in lockstep to debunk and belittle this. In fact, whatever your political, and I say that with to everyone in your radio audience there, a few nights ago, on a show that is generally seen as a very cutting, progressive show, Bill Maher's show, and whether or not you subscribe to his kind of humor, his politics is not the issue here. He once again, as an intelligent person, completely uninformed about how serious the subject is, insulted an extremely courageous pair of people, now gone, and by extension, their niece, one of our greatest scholars on the Betty and Barney Hill case, that's Kathleen Marden, her writing partner Stanton Friedman, and many other courageous people that have tried to educate folks on it. He referred to the fact that last week, I believe, the state of New Hampshire actually unveiled a national sign on the highway where Betty and Barney experienced their UFO abduction experience. And it is an official state sign. It's not about the myth or the legend. It's about the reality. And, you'd see it the same way you'd seen another historic designation sign. And his bon mot was to the effect of, this obviously illustrates how loopy the people of New Hampshire are, and what really was absolutely phenomenal that caught everybody's attention was that Betty and Barney were an interracial couple in 1961. 61. Ha ha ha. For me, that is, first, it's ignorance. Second, it's the equivalent of, let's just say, even though you don't believe it, that there are things beyond your understanding, that perhaps there are such things as alien abductions, and if somebody comes forward who has been traumatized by this kind of thing or believes they have been, and one should, kind of pity them for being mentally ill, it's the equivalent of making fun of somebody for having reported a rape. That is the level that this humor functions at. And I really have very little tolerance for it, no matter who the individual is or how high up they are in public life politically or in entertainment or what have you. Again, it's a small kind of footnote to the subject. And of course, Betty and Barney Hill's experience did happen not far from the incident at Exeter, also in the beautiful state of New Hampshire.
I think you're totally on point, and although I've laughed at a few of Bill Maher's shows,
he's a funny guy, and I like his humor. This is an area, though, where it doesn't matter, again, who cares whether you're on the left or the right here. It's just, for me, an example of somebody in public life who I think is very sharp and certainly a great social commentator from their point of view, who falls into an area of, let's have some fun with this subject that everybody knows is silly. I'll bet if you or I were invited to be on Bill's show and we're going one-to-one with him, and we said, how do you know that this doesn't happen? And he'd just say, well, of course it doesn't. It's nonsense. Have you ever read a single book on UFOs? Well, no, why bother? It's just nonsense. I'm a busy guy. I don't have time to read such things. Welcome to the wonderful world of the post-war reality and the duality of intelligent people, many of them highly credentialed scientists, astronomers, leading politicians, leaders in industry and business, who know, quote unquote, that this is nonsense because we have all been so deeply socially conditioned by the media, by the government, to quote unquote know it's a silly subject. So why bother to spend any of your valuable time, quote unquote, educating yourself to it when it's a UFO book, for God's sakes? You know, I wouldn't be seen dead reading one, and you know, I'm sure there are no good ones, because if there were, people like me would know about them. Well, you know, there's hubris for you big time.
Absolutely. In order to kind of bring this back on focus, I knew that we were going to talk about Betty and Barney Hill, and I found a particularly poignant quote from Barney that just grabs me, because it points out how this UFO phenomena, you know, we can deal with it as an abstraction or as an intellectual subject, but for some people it's intensely personal. And here is a quote from his transcript. This is Barney talking about the events of September 19th, 1961. He's in a car with his wife. They're coming home from vacation, and this is just a small part of his testimony. It's an airplane, lots of windows. Betty wants to believe in this thing, and I don't. I want to hear a jet so badly. Betty is making me angry. Look at it. It's strange. It's not a plane. I want to hear a hum or a motor. I can't look. I have to drive that car. I try to maintain control. I can't let Betty know I'm scared. I've got to go get my gun. It's like a big, big pancake with rows of windows and one huge light. It can't be true. This isn't there. Can't somebody come and tell me that this is not there?
You know, James, even as you were saying those words, I was remembering hearing them for the first time, because what some of your listeners may not be aware of was, after this event happened to Betty and Barney, their lives became something else again, and the disturbances, the terror, the phobias that began to affect them, especially poor Barney, were more than they could bear. And ultimately, they met with a psychotherapist, hypnotherapist, who had perfected his work working with World War II veterans of what they referred to at the time as shell shock, post-traumatic stress disorder, battle-related as we know today. And this is the first incident that we're aware of, I think, in history, where people who had had a direct encounter were hypnotized, completely separately, of course, in every respect, and brought back to relive their memories. These tapes, for me, are absolutely shattering, and in fact, they're heartbreaking in many ways. The niece of Betty and Barney, Kathleen Marden, has gone on to become one of our great scholars in UFO studies, and working with Stanton Friedman, wrote a terrific book called Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. I believe they're just finishing up a follow-up book to it. And Kathy has just released a DVD that I just got an advance copy of, and it's called Betty and Barney Hill in Their Own Words. Now, for those of you listening who have ever heard Kathleen speak, you know she is not just a compelling presenter, but her presentations are extremely professional. And you see all the locations, you see a great deal of archival material, but her aunt bequeathed to her all of these reel-to-reel tapes, among other, material directly related to the incidents. And those tapes have been remastered. And the results are on a new DVD called Betty and Barney Hill in Their Own Words. Also, some of your listeners may remember, and I expect somewhere along the line you may have seen, the 1975 made-for-television movie about their event. It starred Estelle Parsons and James Earl Jones. And those sequences where they are reliving these events are enough to make you jump out of your seat. This is not funny stuff. It's not mystical. It's not delusional. This is the real deal. And it's incredibly disturbing, and it's extremely human. And for anybody that's sitting there saying, well, these guys they don't know what they're talking about, or they're quote-unquote believers, begin to educate yourself about this and get back to us about your impressions after you've either read material on this or watched that DVD or heard Kathleen speak or seen a print of that film, which is available from Netflix and the like. And I think it had no chance of being a commercial success because it's just too incredibly unnerving. It's one of those extraordinarily high anxiety 2-character, 3-character projects, which there's nothing about them that's fun or science fiction-y, and there's no reason they should be that way.
Well, obviously it's really hard for people to admit that we are weak or that we could be controlled by some other species that could just intervene in our lives and take us and do whatever they wanted. And most especially, I don't think the authorities are going to admit that because they're supposed to be our all-knowing protectors.
Yeah, and James, this here is in great part the crux of the problem. People talk about the UFO cover-up. I certainly feel that there is an historic ongoing effort to keep knowledge and information from us that we, at the highest levels of classification, have. But in part, some of what they may be covering up is how little we actually do know, or how little we have learned about the actuality of these other intelligences since 1947. And let's face it, when we talk about our leaders, we're talking about guys and alpha male types overall who have risen to the highest levels of elected and appointed officialdom, or military or intelligence, who really are not fond of being outmaneuvered or really knowing that they're not the largest flea on the back of the great cosmic dog, so to say.
That's for sure. And then, of course, it becomes even more complicated, as if this subject wasn't difficult enough.
Yeah.
Based upon some of the accounts from abductees who indicate that their recollections include people from our military working side by side with non-human beings.
Yeah. And for me, at the very least, certainly some aspect of these other intelligences, I can't call them aliens because it's just a word that I don't think may be accurate, but who knows, that they have the power or the abilities or the technology to appear as they are not, or to affect our thinking or our memories at least on some basis. Some of those can be recovered or seen more accurately in certain circumstances, or may come back in the normal path of time. But again, for most people, this sounds like the cutting edge of 100% nonsense. It can't be. If indeed such a thing were happening, there's no way it could be kept from the people, except, of course, that it is. And you and I know, just from our years of work in the field, statistically, that, to put it mildly, everybody listening, probably everybody you know out there, with any kind of circle of friends, acquaintances, business associates, family, knows someone that, in the phrase of Dr. David Jacobs, is living a secret life, either half-consciously or fully consciously, or just knows that there is an underlying dissonance, dysfunction, anxiety, with all sorts of strange phobias and quite a checklist of tics and perks that add up to a truly anomalous situation where, in fact, part of their reality may be interfacing with these other intelligences. It's just the way it is, but it's just below the surface. It's not acceptable to the great majority of folks out there, certainly in the United States, where I think we have been the most rigidly conditioned. This is not the way it is necessarily in other countries, where the subject is treated more respectfully, taken more seriously, and in some cases openly by the military and highest-ranking political figures, as well as people at large and law enforcement.
Well, it's painfully clear and beautifully clear, looking at the photographs from the Hubble, or the, any time that we get a picture of the Earth back from space, that it's just unpardonable for anybody to intellectually assume that we are the top of all of creation in the entire universe. That just cannot be.
Well, this begs perhaps the touchiest, most sensitive, most loaded aspect of